The number of migrants arriving at the southern border is unprecedented.
Over potential policy changes.
Border and making their way to New York City.
Commemorated the 80th anniversary of the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act. For generations, people of Chinese heritage.
Record number of illegal aliens. Welcome to Unshut Cases. On today's episode, we have with us an incredible attorney out of Austin, Texas, Kate Lincoln-Goldfinch, the founding and managing attorney at Lincoln-Goldfinch Law, Immigration and Bankruptcy Law in Austin, Texas. Kate, thank you so much for joining us here today on Unshut Cases.
My pleasure. I'm excited about this conversation.
Me too. And yeah, this is an interesting one. We're kind of diving into the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is from 1882, and kind of tying it into today, why this still matters. You started law school at the University of Texas. You knew you'd be able to help in the immigration clinic because, you're bilingual, speak English and Spanish. As a student at the clinic, your first assignment was to visit the Hutto Immigrant Detention Center, where she met with a detained family of asylum seekers who had a 5-month-old baby girl, literally wearing a onesie issued by the prison. I'm sure that was impactful when that happened. Her mom asked if she could sneak her baby out with her and take care of her until her parents could get out. Although she couldn't do that, she did represent the family in their successful asylum case. Can you actually tell us a little bit about that? Because that's just such an interesting moment I'm sure that influenced your whole career.
That was the moment,
Yeah.
Well, actually, so the interesting fact about this detention center, it's in the town of Taylor, Texas, which happens to be next to the town of Hutto, Texas. And everyone thinks that it's named after the town, but it's actually named after T. Don Hutto, who is the founder of the Corrections Corporation of America. It's a private prison where immigrants and families at the time were held, including babies, obviously. And, I honestly signed up for the immigration clinic thinking everyone said it was a good clinic. It was like you're in law school and you do what all your friends say. And I thought, okay, well, I'll do the immigration clinic. Yeah, sounds great. I believe in that. And then they sent me to this detention center and I was not prepared. I was so naive. And this mom, who had gone through this horrific story, situation, series of events, asking me to take her baby and take care of her baby until she could get out of this place. I mean, that night I went home, I was just sobbing. It was like, I went from this moment of this is, the United States of America as a nation of immigrants and the Statue of Liberty says all of this stuff about who we are to this like slammed in the face with the reality of how we're actually treating people who are asking for protection.
Yeah.
And I was hooked, from that point on, I was all immigration all the way. And I did asylum for a few years only with families in detention. And then since then I've branched out and I do a lot more types of immigration, but it was the moment, hopefully all of us can be as lucky to have a moment that grabs your passion and your attention and your intrigue and is your career like that, because it's been quite a journey for me.
Yeah, that is an incredible story. And it sounds like just such a turning point, which is always interesting to me. Just kind of those moments in life that really kind of redirect us or get us where we're like, this is what I'm doing. Just to kind of give a little bit more background on you. Right now, you're serving as Mayor Adler's Commissioner on Immigrant Affairs for the city of Austin, which is awesome. Pro bono liaison for the American Immigration Lawyers Association Texas chapter, and serve as the chair of the board of directors of Vicina, which is an immigration mentoring organization. So yeah, obviously, for someone to bring in and talk about this Chinese Exclusion Act, what it was, how it came about, why it matters now, you are the perfect person for this. So again, thank you, Kate, for being here with us today to kind of go through this.
Awesome. I'm happy to discuss this. Honestly, this is the Chinese Exclusion Act is something that I, learned about, studied, and you might think on its face, like, oh, not that relevant to today's events, which is wholly inaccurate. I mean, we are in such a repeat right now of the goings on of that era. So it's really important, I think, for us to examine it in the context of today's politics.
Yeah. And the climate or the culture of xenophobia, right, that we're kind of up against. So to kind of overview what the Chinese Exclusion Act is, I'll give a brief overview and then we can dive into kind of everything that you can give us insight on. Chinese Exclusion Act was a federal law prohibiting all immigration of Chinese laborers for 10 years. 1882, it was the first major U.S. law ever implemented to prevent all members of a specific national group from immigrating. Here was the lead up to kind of give context. California Gold Rush, very famous mid 19th century, and construction of the first transcontinental railroad led to a surge in Chinese immigration to the U.S. However, as gold and jobs became scarcer, many U.S. residents began to feel animosity towards the Chinese. Again, the xenophobia. Public opinion and law in California began to demonize Chinese workers and immigrants in any role, with the latter half of the 1800s seeing a series of ever more restrictive laws being placed on Chinese labor, behavior, and even living conditions. Chinese immigrant workers provided cheap labor, did not use government schools, hospitals, and such because the Chinese migrant population was predominantly healthy male adults. The North Adams strike of 1870, broken by the replacement of all workers by 75 Chinese men, was the trigger that sparked widespread working class protests across the country. You had the Page Act of 1875. This banned Chinese women from entering the United States to prevent the settlement of families, but continued to allow Chinese men and their labor. Congress tried to, again, exclude working class Chinese laborers for a period of 20 years, but a compromise was made after President Chester A. Arthur vetoed the original bill, so it was then reduced to 10 years. And then we have the impact. So the Chinese Exclusion Act excluded Chinese laborers, meaning skilled and unskilled laborers, and Chinese people employed in mining, from entering the country for 10 years under the penalty of imprisonment, deportation. The act's method of radicalizing the Chinese as a threat to America's values and working class became the foundation of America's gatekeeping ideology. The departure of many skilled and unskilled Chinese workers led to an across-the-board economic decline. This was greatly objected by the Chinese government and people, who viewed America as a bullish and imperial power who undermined China. Following the passing of the Chinese Exclusion Act, period known as the driving out era was born. So in this period, anti-Chinese Americans physically forced Chinese communities to flee to other areas. This included the Rock Springs Massacre of 1885 and the Hell's Canyon Massacre of 1887. In 1898, Wong Kim Arc, who was born in San Francisco in 1873, had been denied re-entry to the United States after a trip abroad. He challenged the government's refusal to recognize his citizenship, and the Supreme Court ruled in his favor. So this case came up in 2018 to speak to what you were mentioned before, Kate, about, why this is so important now. This case came up in 2018 when then President Donald Trump announced his intention to issue an executive order abolishing birthright citizenship for U.S. born children of non-citizens. So yeah, that's kind of the, all the details there. But to kind of dive into some questions we have when looking at the lead up to the act, this 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act being passed, when did the perception of Chinese immigrants switch after that first railroad was constructed? Can you kind of take us back to what you know about how this all came about at that time?
Sure. So at the time, the economy, mid 1800s, economy is booming. The gold rush is occurring. The Transcontinental Railroad, it's like you imagine the two railroad points meeting in the middle. And the railroad companies actually primarily were the ones who went and found Chinese laborers and brought them to the U.S. for the purposes of completing the railroad. So while all that was going on, Chinese immigrants were mostly sort of contained, to railroad work. And there wasn't a lot of expansion of that community out into the sort of broader community of the United States. So then what happened is, as the railroad is completed, there's an economic downturn. The two things are, not related as far as I understand it. And what that meant is that some of these Chinese laborers were starting to expand their, worker horizons. So they were going and looking into other areas at the same time that many white workers were, having more difficulty finding work. And so, and just naturally what occurred, because this is just the knee-jerk reaction, is that Chinese workers were scapegoated for, stealing the jobs, et cetera, even though data at the time and current data shows that immigrants tend to fill different jobs than U.S. workers. To the extent they are filling jobs, they fill sort of adjacent jobs. And then also they end up boosting the economy by being entrepreneurial, et cetera, such that actually more jobs are created due to the workers. So even though that's the scapegoating, that's not the reality. But another thing that was going on at the time is, the sort of political rhetoric around them. There were politicians at the time who were like, oh, it's the Chinese workers who are taking all your jobs. And that was riling people up. So that's sort of the backdrop of what was occurring around this time.
Okay. It seems the issue itself grew out of problems from the people that were living in California at this time and working there. How did California manage to push that rhetoric out to the rest of the country? Because again, we're not talking about now, right? Where information travels so quickly. We're literally going back 140 plus years. How did that kind of spread? And I'm sure obviously, as problematic as everything is now, you can imagine 140 years ago, it was worse, I would have to think. So can you just kind of speak to that, of how that spread from California around to other parts of the country?
Because of the completion of the railroad, the West was gaining national attention and power. They were sort of in the hearts and the minds of the media and the people all over the US. This was like a new frontier. It was exciting, it was interesting, and it was seen as like, could I use the word harbinger? It was like, this is whatever they're experiencing is new and fresh and it's coming our way. So it was also like people experience whatever they were saying in California is about to be our problem too. So the national, there were, of course, newspapers at the time, and they were running all of these political cartoons depicting, if you look at, it just blows your mind the way that they depicted Chinese laborers, and they talked about like killing them and throwing them in the ocean. And, one I think that's really interesting, because sort of prior to that, it had been, instead of Chinese, the sort of marginalized people were Catholic, non-Protestant,
Right.
white English speaking immigrants, and the Irish. And so there's this one cartoon where I'm trying to remember, it's like the two, like on one side is an Irishman and on the other side is a Chinese man, and the two are like gobbling up Uncle Sam. There's like a man in between them who's Uncle Sam, and they're gobbling him up. And then at the end, the Chinese guy just goes and eats the Irishman. It's like, well, this is the bad guy taking over. That was in the newspaper, it was in the national news. Everybody saw it, and they all were just like, okay, yeah, this is what's happening. And then of course the politicians, we see this so much today. The politicians are all like, they're stealing your jobs. This is bad. I'm going to fix it. Donate to my campaign, vote for me. And everybody believes them. And so there you have it. It was like, that part was not difficult, convincing the population of the West that the Chinese workers were their problem, and then spreading that east was easy, piece of cake.
Yeah. It's interesting that you bring up the media at the time, right? Which appeared in the newspapers. When I was in undergrad college a long time ago, I studied film, and I took one class that was called African Americans and Latinos in Film and TV. And a lot of it was about, there was the things that were more recent, big filmmakers, Spike Lee and everything, that was doing things and our time or closer to our time. But then it went all the way back to the early 1900s and the 1800s. And we saw a lot of that, about how they were just basically really, I don't know if I would use brainwashing, but you really were like actually pushing this narrative that was so destructive and so anti-immigrant and xenophobic and racist and just horrible to dehumanize. It was really about dehumanizing all of these people in a way that was just horrible. And that was just the norm, right, in media for all of this time. And I guess to your point, that's had to the question of how did this spread? Well, there was this media, they were able to actually push this narrative and kind of dehumanize these Chinese laborers and Chinese immigrants that were coming over. So, had the U.S. seen this widespread demand for nation-specific immigration bans before? And I'm talking about in the 1880s. Obviously, again, I am going to come back to now, because it is insane how we're somehow back to a lot of the same rhetoric 140 years later. But prior to 1880, were there instances of this where you mentioned the Irish, for example, were there pushbacks there that I guess happened before the Chinese Exclusion Act?
There was sentiment. There was public sentiment in pockets of populations, but there was never a national ban on a national group like this, and never has been since, up until, Trump introduced the Muslim bans of his era. And another interesting quote, there's a Benjamin Franklin quote, who's an English guy, of English descent. And there's this quote from him where he's talking about German settlers, and he's concerned that they are going to Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them, and they are never going to adopt our complexion or our language. It's just fascinating. You think about an English guy talking about German, Benjamin Franklin. So of course there was a lot of that in the public, in groups, and there were bans on people, on prostitutes and people with communicable diseases, etc. So it wasn't as if everyone's welcome.
Sure.
But there was never, like, Congress did not pass if you're from this particular country or this group of people, you may not come here, up until that point, or really, frankly, ever since. Not anything that targeted.
Yeah, it's interesting. It is like an anomaly, despite xenophobia not being an anomaly, right? We have like discrimination and race, this ugly history, that is unique to America in some ways, but is also global. You see, it's not like we're the only country with these issues. But considering that, to have this only happen once is sort of interesting, despite the things that are more recent. To your point, the attempt at the Muslim ban by Trump and the birthright citizenship and all those things that, again, that I do want to get to. In terms of, to kind of dovetail off that, because you mentioned it, you said there hasn't really been nation-specific immigration bans since then, so dating now. But can we touch on the stuff that's more recent? Because again, this came up, we just had the debate this past week, which was, we don't need to get to that. but this stuff did come up in the debate, of course, and Trump said stupid things that, were just kind of related directly to this, again, about immigrants, coming in and stealing jobs and so on and so forth. How is this going to come into this election cycle again? And just if you can kind of touch on some of those things now, and how they're back in the zeitgeist, how immigration is back at the forefront of all these political conversations as we're literally 4 months out from the election at this point.
Probably one of the top issues, sort of absurdly. There is so much that matters so much to us, and the fact that all of this time is spent on enforcing the border when there's not actually a problem. That's the thing. I mean, they would have us think that there's some horrific invasion that is, threatening us all. That's not actually the case. But it's, we are here again. So you look at the Chinese Exclusion Act, you look at what was happening, you look at what was being said and how people were reacting and responding to that. And here we are, pretty much exactly the same place, except instead of Chinese workers, we are looking to Cuban, Venezuelan, Central American, Haitian immigrants along the border. And what's also interesting is that in each of these sort of like these periods of extreme anti-immigrant sentiment, it happened in the late 1700s with the Irish and the Germans, happened in the late 1800s with Chinese, happened in the early 1900s, post-World War I, again post-World War II with Eastern Europeans, Italians, Jews, Jewish people, and now with what I would call South and Central American asylum seekers. Each of these moments is a moment in time in our nation where we have actually a need for expanded immigration. That there's this point in time when it's a tech boom, it's a railroad boom, it's the baby boomers are aging for right now, and we need more immigrants. And so there's this burbling desire or need on a national level for more people to come here. And then there's this reaction from anti-immigrant xenophobic groups and the politicians who speak to them, who are saying bad, wrong, this is going to hurt you. And ultimately, I think it is because what is coming is another shifting in the population of this nation. It's going to look and sound a little bit different because we need these more people. But isn't that what makes us great? There's a whole group of people here who say, no, I want to pretend like there is a world in which my nation will stay exactly the same today as it is in 10 years, which is absurd. But, that's where we are. We're there again.
Yeah. And it's bizarre because, not to make light of it, but it's like the only population here that could like actually have a claim to that statement is like Native Americans. We are a country of immigrants. Like this country from the last 400, 500 years is not the people that were native to this land. Every single person that came here that's not a Native American came here from somewhere else, so to suddenly sort of be pinpointing these different places and saying, oh, no, the gates are closed for you. It's a little hypocritical.
I often, sorry to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
I think about this a lot because I think it's actually a very extremely small group of people who are 100% descended from Native Americans or from
Sure.
enslaved people. Because
Yeah.
same deal, I sort of exempt them. They didn't make the choice to immigrate. So, but most people have also been blended in with immigration in their blood. I don't know what the percentage is. My guess is it's 98% plus have immigration in our history. So totally agree with you on that
Yeah.
point.
How did the media, going back to the 1882 Act, Chinese Exclusion Act, because you touched on it before, how did the media play into the passing of the act? Obviously, like you said, there was these blatantly racist sort of attacks on the Chinese laborers and Chinese immigrants at the moment. Was that sort of the thrust of it in terms of the media coming in at this time, or were there other elements of media? Was there pushback at that time from any groups that were saying, hey, no, this is not okay? Other than obviously, I'm sure the Chinese immigrants were pushing back against it, but were there actually other people here that were a dissenting voice in the media?
I mean, I'm certain that there were, of course. In all of my reading and researching about this case, I've never come upon, mention of
Yeah.
some big, like the business community pushback,
Right.
et cetera. Nothing like that. And I think it was like, oh, this is California's problem. And we all of a sudden care what California thinks over here in Washington. And so let's knock out this problem that is theirs before it becomes ours. I think that's how it was viewed, and that there was very little pushback. Interestingly enough, there was in the next sort of immigration, the big immigration reform. So there was this Chinese Exclusion Act that was the first ever of its kind, like national ban. Then there was another sort of ban in 1917 that was aimed at Eastern Europeans, Southern Europeans, and it was the literacy test. It required any immigrant to be literate. So that was the next one. And then the next one after that was the quota, the national quota law, which I think was in 1924. And so that one was an actual attempt by Congress to pass a racist immigration law to keep America white. But they knew that if they, on its face, passed a racist immigration law, they were going to be blocked by the Supreme Court. So they spent a couple of years actually grappling with how do we pass a racist law and get away with it. And what they ended up with was the Quota Act, which essentially said we're going to take a snapshot of the US population and we're going to give away the available visas to people in the ratio in which the US population exists, meaning like, okay, so if 90% of the people are of English descent, then 90% of the visas go to English people. And they, continued the ban against Asian people and that, et cetera. And that so obviously was an extremely racist law and really achieved what they were after. And we didn't get another law passed until 1965. So from 1924 to 1965, there was this extremely racist law in place. And I think our nation looks a lot different today than how it would otherwise look had that not been in place. Both the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Quota Law of 1924 changed the complexion of this country.
That's really, really interesting. In the case of the United States versus Wong Kim Arc, which we touched on a little earlier, how did that come to be, and how did the result impact the Exclusion Act?
The case of Wong Kim Arc was a test of birthright citizenship. And I think there was a group that was looking to test this part of the Constitution, this idea of birthright citizenship, and they used the Chinese Exclusion Act as their way to test. And so the actual facts of the case are this guy, Wong Kim Arc, was a US-born child of Chinese immigrant parents. And so while the Chinese Immigrant or Exclusion Act was passed, he happened to be in China visiting relatives. And he came back to the country after the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed on a boat. And so he was not permitted to come back into the country because they said, you're a Chinese immigrant, but actually he had been born on US soil. And so while he was on the ship, he wasn't allowed to come onto the country. His case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court essentially took up this question of birthright citizenship while he's on the ship. And they said, I mean, again, it was like they were racist and they pretty much said it. But the reasoning, it was like a pretty, majority decision, 6-2 or something like that at the time. And they said, first of all, It's in the Constitution that anyone born on U.S. soil is a U.S. citizen. Second of all, if we were to change that, what then would we do with all of the other immigrants from England and Ireland and, all of the other places who were born on U.S. soil to immigrant parents? What would happen to their citizenship? So it was like, the way I read it was, okay, yeah, but what will we do with all the white people? And so because of that, they held firm, I mean, thankfully, to the idea of birthright citizenship in the Constitution. And so that's why when, Trump makes these like claims that he's going to end birthright citizenship, it's laughable because it's like, this is going back centuries to the Constitution, to the Supreme Court. You would have to have a constitutional amendment to change that. And so it's absurd to think that he would, but it's also just like a fundamental idea of this nation, and it would upend everything to change it.
Yeah. What was the turning point to eventually repeal the act in 1943? And how did the Magnuson Act affect this decision?
So this part I have studied a little bit less, but my understanding of at the time, the Magnuson Act and the time that this was repealed, this was really more about diplomatic relations with China and wanting to see China more as an ally of this country during World War II and sort of separating out our relationship with Japan and China. And so that it was of course less about not being racist anymore and more about sort of, from a diplomatic lens, what do we need to do to make this better?
Yeah, that sounds familiar, honestly, in terms of how we operate. And what should we learn? Obviously, there's a lot to learn, but in terms of learning from this and this period of history, again, as we've touched on, it's so relevant still right now. How can we kind of absorb what we know about how this went down, this Chinese Exclusion Act 142 years ago, and apply that to today?
Well, I think what I was sharing about sort of how learning from the rhetoric of the past and seeing the patterns to open our eyes into what's really happening right now, because the time of the Chinese Exclusion Act, the time of the literacy test, the time of the Quota Act, all of these moments contained the exact same rhetoric. If you look at the cartoons, the immigrants, the Italian immigrants, there's this one that I often show people that shows how you dispose of Italian immigrants. And it shows rounding them up in paddy wagons, putting them in cages and dropping them in the ocean. And, Italian immigrants. And so it's like, we have been here before so very many times.
Right.
And we have these politicians who are attempting to convince us that immigrants are bad, that they are swarming, that they are dangerous, that they are taking our jobs, that they are trafficking children or drugs, etc., and that we need to be afraid of them. And then fear is a very strong motivator for people, so that they get afraid and they support these politicians who are going to save them from these awful immigrants. And then the media, frankly, also gets paid for clicks. And so it is in their interest to also scare people. We know that. And so it's just not it doesn't, like, the message I'm giving us here today does not sell quite so much as look at the numbers of the immigrants swarming over the border who have fentanyl. Not true, but sounds a lot better in a headline, and so really at the end of the day, what needs to happen overall on this question is all of us need to open our eyes, stop believing this anti-immigrant rhetoric that is lies, and understand that this is a nation with a need for immigrant labor, more than we ever have in the past. Like I said, our baby boomers are aging. In all sectors, we need more immigrants in agricultural, but also in tech and innovation, the whole swath. And what we need to do is collectively stop believing, can I swear on this thing?
Yes, that's totally
Stop
fine.
believing the bullshit about immigration being bad, and then turn to Congress and say to them, y'all get your act together and pass immigration reform that reflects the needs of this economy, that expands the ability for people to come here to work, that expands the ability for people to petition for their family members, that expands the ability for people to access asylum. And then you fix all of that, and then it's going to have an immediate impact on the southern border, because what we have right now is an immigration need without a legal way for people to do it. So people come to the border and then we get all riled up about it. It's like the stupidest thing ever of all time. And the solution is so simple, but nobody will do it because our politicians are getting too much from scaring the crap out of us. That's it. That's the truth.
Yeah. That was very well said. And I appreciate that. And we appreciate you, Kate, for being on here today with us on Unshut Cases. Again, Kate Lincoln-Goldfinch, thank you so much. Kate, can you tell our audience where they can find you?
Sure. It's my website, Lincoln-Goldfinch.com. And if you search my name, I do a lot of videos and stuff like that. So just search me on whatever social media platform you want to use, Kate Lincoln-Goldfinch, and you'll find me there.
Awesome. Well, again, Kate, thank you for being here with us today on Unshut Cases, and we hope to have you back soon.
My pleasure. Thanks, Dan.